I can't believe it's been 20 years, but TWA Flight 800 was blown out of the sky 20 years ago this month off the coast of Long Island. There were some 258 FBI witnesses who reported an apparent missile strike. The entire situation, the entire investigation stank right from the beginning because of the tight control that the government maintained on everything. For example, usually in a crash situation, the point group is the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB. But immediately the FBI came roaring in and grabbed control of everything, and the NTSB had to work with the FBI. There's a lot more to that, but to be honest with you, as a pilot and as a newsman who was covering this actively at the time, I have never felt comfortable or felt that we got the truth from the official explanation of the center fuel tank exploding. And if you talk to a lot of pilots, they agree with that. This month, Jack Cashel has a new book out, TWA 800, The Crash, The Cover-Up, The Conspiracy. Regnery is publishing it. He's an independent writer and producer and occasionally executive editor of Ingram's magazine, and he's written for a lot of name publications. But first of all, Jack, I can't believe it's been 20 years since we were talking about this, but it has.
Yeah, it's 20 years ago. Yeah.
Has anything changed since then, or are we rehashing what is a story that needs to be told once again? Because there are people in their 20s now who weren't alive when that happened.
Right. Well, actually, it's no longer rehashing, thanks to two really stunning bits of new evidence. One is a video shot 5 days before the crash off the coast of Long Island. Clearly shows a missile test, and we know from both the FBI and CIA documents that they all acknowledged that that's what it was, or that it was a missile. I didn't say it was a test. Now, this has real strong evidentiary value because the FBI insisted that there had been no missile tests in that area for 2 years, at least. The second thing, and more importantly, is this, and I don't know how it was released or why, either through carelessness or indifference, in response to a Freedom of Information Act request, the CIA released this motherlode of documentation, memoranda and the like, that unquestionably about the role the CIA played in corrupting this investigation. And reading it, and this just came, I just saw it within the last year, I was stunned. We knew the sausage at the end. We knew the CIA that they made, the animation of discrediting the eyewitnesses of a plane with its nose falling off, zooming upwards. Now I have to see how the sausage was made. And it's incredible, John. I mean, they manufactured eyewitness statements for multiple key eyewitnesses. They just made them up out of whole cloth because the real witness statements didn't fit their agenda. And they coerced the FBI into accepting it. And the FBI had, of course, coerced the NTSB right out of the chute. It is the single most successful cover-up in American peacetime history and the most consequential because by doing this, they indirectly opened the doors to September 11th.
Yeah, also remember after the bombing at the Murrow office building, there was a large number of eyewitnesses who saw a third person get out of the truck with Timothy McVeigh the morning of April 19th, and that quickly disappeared from the whole narrative. And the FBI, same FBI, has been fighting the release of those tapes that would have clearly shown what happened right up to the moment of the detonation along the street there in Oklahoma City. So one has to scratch their head and say, why do we have these cover-ups? So take it from TWA 800. What's up?
Well, it's pretty simple. And it basically is the same reason they covered up Benghazi in 2012. They had an election they had to win, a re-election campaign. And in both cases, I think what they really just tried to do initially was to kick the can down the road past November. And once you start kicking that can, you can't kick it back, In fact, there was an interview that Bill Clinton, president then, gave to Taylor Branch, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, who interviewed him once a month. And these interviews weren't released until 2010. And about 2 weeks after the crash, Clinton was telling Branch, he thought it was missiles, he thought it was Iran. And he was saying that, we'll probably have to reconstruct the plane, and that can take months, Well, yeah, that was the deal with the reconstruction. It'll take months before we can get an official answer, right? And by that time, the die had been cast. Clinton was reelected. The media didn't want to know any more than they had to know, and don't want to know any more than they have to know today.
Well, if you remember Bill Clinton, I didn't mean to bring in Oklahoma City, but Bill Clinton said that Oklahoma City saved his presidential campaign because it enabled them to demonize the right, which is why the whole idea about a Middle Eastern type involved was suppressed.
That's exactly right. And he said that literally to the press on his campaign plane. And what they did, you're right, every eyewitness, and there were about at least 20 of them, who saw Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City on the morning of April 19th, 1995, saw him in the company of a short, swarthy, Mideastern-looking guy, John Doe number 2. And then all of a sudden, there was no John Doe number 2. The search for John Doe number 2, like the search for the whoever fired the missiles at TWA Flight 800, just went away, and the media was happy with it because it satisfied their need to reelect Bill Clinton.
Wasn't there a journalist who managed to get a piece of seat fabric from the airplane and had it tested, and there was missile residue on it, and they prosecuted him? Am I correct?
You were right, because that was James Sanders, and he and I collaborated on our earlier video and book. James and his wife Elizabeth, along with their source, who was a TWA 747 pilot and manager named Terry Stacy, were all arrested. What Stacy did is he originally intended to scrape off some residue, and when the residue wouldn't scrape, he just took out a pinch of foam rubber. And for that pinch of foam rubber, the Sanders, James and Elizabeth, were tried in the federal court and convicted of conspiracy because the jury was not allowed to know that James was an investigative reporter. So they tried him for stealing airplane parts. Now, if he had been able to get off the residue alone, they couldn't have even tried him on that since the residue wasn't a part. But that's how they rolled. And the media, no one protested. They said, you're sending a reporter to a prison for, reporting? In a cover-up, he was a whistleblower. But the word whistleblower only shows up when there's a Republican president. Otherwise, you're crooks and thieves and conspiracy theorists.
So what was the cause of the downing? If we assume it's a missile, then the next question would be, whose missile? Was it simply an accident from a missile test?
Yeah, I would like to have thought it was a terrorist. I mean, I will tell you your audience this with 100% confidence that missiles, more than one surface-to-air missile, blew TWA Flight 800 out of the sky. When I first got into this, John, I had presumed it was a terrorist. I kind of hoped it was a terrorist because I didn't want to think that our Navy was capable of screwing up like that. But, in fact, when you look at all the evidence, and I come to this position reluctantly, the evidence overwhelmingly argues for a naval misfire. Now, there may have been a terrorist element in the mix. They may have been trying to take out a small plane. That's not impossible. But what is, I think, beyond doubt at this point is that our Navy fired those missiles. No other Navy or no other terrorist is capable of that much firepower.
Yeah, and so if it was a foreign terrorist power, you didn't want that because it was an election year. That would really put a damper on his presidency. But B, if it were a mistake on the part of the U.S. government or its agencies or assigns, boy, that's a big faux pas to swallow. And then you can see the finger pointing starting, well, who's responsible for this? Blah, blah, blah. Exactly.
And what happened is that, if you recall, after the 1994 midterm elections, the Clintons were hammered, and they lost both houses of Congress, and they were in danger of not getting the election nod again, being nominated even by their own party. Back then, the Democratic Party had at least some shred of credibility. But they clawed out of this. They, raised hundreds of millions of dollars illegally, and it was a desperate campaign to get back in the good graces of the American people. But a telling moment came like a couple months before this crash. It was the 1996 Masters. And starting with the 7-stroke lead on the final round was Clinton's one friend on the Republican-friendly PGA Tour, and that was Greg Norman. And Norman blew the 7-stroke lead. And Clinton, from that day on, would go to his staff whenever something bad threatened and say, Greg Norman, Greg Norman, Greg Norman. We're not going to be Greg Normanized. We're not going to blow this lead no matter what. Now, he probably could have weathered the incident if he had told the truth about it initially and blamed the Navy or whatever. But his vulnerability was as commander-in-chief. People didn't trust him. They may have liked him. Economy was going okay. But they didn't trust him as commander-in-chief. And they made that decision on night one to bring in the CIA to sabotage the investigation, and it worked. It's a shame, but it was successful, and it was successful because the same media who could get thoroughly upset about a 24-year-old DUI against George Bush had no interest in knowing about the most consequential cover-up in our history.
It is interesting that of the 258 FBI witnesses who reported the missile strike, the New York Times never interviewed one of them.
Not a single one of them, which is shocking. And what we learned in the CIA documents is that within 2 weeks, of the crash, the FBI missile team, which at that time was doing its job in good faith, came to the CIA and said, listen, we've already interviewed 144 excellent, that was their term, eyewitnesses to a missile strike. Their evidence is overwhelming, said the FBI, their word. Their testimony is too consistent, their word, for it to be anything other than a missile. And then with the CIA guy, in the memos we found, brags about how he tried to dissuade the FBI from going public with that report. Well, they did not go public with that report. 2 weeks later, they had obviously been gotten to, probably by the White House in that interval, because when they talk to the New York Times, they give them one eyewitness to talk to. And it was an eyewitness who saw out of the corner of his eye what appeared to be a bomb blast, like a big, white, bright, high-energy explosion. So the New York Times ran with the lead that now it seems like a bomb blew up Flight 800, and it's, quote, substantially weakened the case for a missile. That was the 144 excellent eyewitnesses disappeared in 2 weeks, and now we're down to one guy who just saw the aftermath or the tail end of the incident. He just happened to turn his head at the last second, and that's why he didn't see a missile, and that's why they gave him to the New York Times. He was the only eyewitness the FBI allowed the New York Times to talk to.
Well, as you well know right now, there is a brutal assault on freedom of speech across a whole panoply of areas, which I think is actually threatening to a free society. But we have Mrs. Clinton running for the office of president, and she was part of her husband's administration, and that's where the cover-up was. So what are the implications for this election?
Well, we've seen it already. I mean, you saw this clumsy attempt a couple weeks ago by it was silly, by the White House to redact all references to Allah, to the Islamic State, from the Orlando shooter, 9/11 call. But, the real issue here isn't actual suppression of the media by the White House. The real issue is the willful self-suppression by the major American media of any news during an election cycle that does not benefit their candidate. And I'm talking across the board. I've tried. I've been knocking my head against this wall for the last month. They do not want to talk to me. The Newsday, the Long Island newspaper, ran an editorial attacking my book without having read it. And on Long Island, there are thousands of people who saw this incident. Everyone you talk to on Long Island will say, oh, the whole government cover-up was a crock, blah, blah, blah. And Newsday just puts its hands over his ears and the blinders on its eyes and won't talk to them, won't talk to me. They just don't want to know. And that's the shocking thing. And people who have not had this experience with the major media sometimes have a hard time accepting this. Because John, they'll say, any reporter worth his salt would jump on this story. No, they would not, because they know that their bosses don't want to hear what they have to say.
You do have by the way, a book out on the subject of intolerance, which is why I decided to blend that in here.
Yeah, right. I call it Scarlet Letters, right. And what they do, they just call you a racist. The nice thing about this book is no one's called me a racist yet.
But give it enough time, they'll figure out a way to do that.
They'll find an angle. Yeah, right.
It's what I've been trying to explain to people for the 25 years we've been on the air doing this show, giving them the benefit of my media background, that starting in the 70s and 80s in the journalism schools, they changed the emphasis from being reporters of the news to being social activists. And that's where you started to see this change, Jack. And they were able to keep the pretense up. Talk radio started really with a vengeance in the 80s. We moved into the internet radio and internet newspapers in the 90s, which has kept these issues alive. But they, at the very same time, they were able to keep the pretense of being unbiased up. Now that's shattered. At least I hope it is. I guess for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, most people see through it or want to see through it. And, and it's interesting because this event took place just on the cusp of the internet age in 1996. And I looked up the numbers then. About 10% of the American people were online at the time. If it had been today, they never could have gotten away with this because the witnesses would have discovered each other. The eyewitnesses haven't shut up. They're the greatest allies of the truth in this case. They don't have pensions. They're not, they're not being held in abeyance by the fear of losing them. But had the internet been available in 1996, it would have been a different story. And you know what they did, though, John? It was kind of fascinating when you go back and look at this. Once rumors started spreading on the internet, the major media turned on the internet with a fury, and they haven't let up, really. They're still